What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. So, the news came out today that the college football playoff format is staying as the same four-team playoff system until the end of the current contract, which will be in 2025. So, the earliest we will see an expanded playoff is in the 2026 season. Now, most of the reaction that I've seen to this news has been negative, as I expected, but I wanted to make a video to talk about why we don't really need expansion as much as everybody says, and why I think this is actually a good thing for the sport. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Alright, so to begin with, I feel like we need to properly define what the purpose of the playoff really is, because this seems to get misconstrued in my opinion. The purpose and the role of the playoff is to crown the best team in every college football season. That is it. And so, anything we do or change about the playoff should be to that end, meaning that we should be focused on finding a better way to realistically crown a true champion at the end of the year. And honestly, I don't see how expansion does that. At least not the expansion everybody is clamoring for. Most people I see want at minimum 8 teams, but the 12 and 16 team formats are even more commonly championed. I could understand an argument for 6 teams, although I don't necessarily agree with it. I can see how that could reasonably help you crown a more true champion than the current 4-team playoff does, as it would allow for teams like this year's Ohio State to make the playoff, and they have the talent to legitimately make a potential run through the playoff. Although I still wouldn't bet on them to do it, they legitimately would have a puncher's shot in the playoff, especially this past season. And, they would be a legitimate contender. It would also allow for some teams who kind of started off a little bit slow but heated up a lot later into the season to potentially make the playoff when they're playing at their best, and their best may be the best in the country. Think of like 2020 Oklahoma, for example. Again, I don't think they would have won the playoff, but you could see them, and that could be a somewhat interesting thing where they have a legitimate shot at it. However, anything past that and you're really stretching it, to me 6 is already stretching it, but anything beyond that is a real stretch. I don't think anybody who actually watches college football a lot legitimately thinks that the teams in the 7 to 16 or however far you want to go have any real shot at making a playoff run. And to me, if they aren't going to change the final outcome of the playoff and they therefore don't contribute to crowning a true champion, then what's the point? The main argument that I see here is that while granted these lower tier teams likely aren't going to change the outcome of the playoff, it will create more fun and interesting games to watch in the postseason. And while yes, I agree some of these matchups would be fun to see, that's not the purpose of the playoff. We already have bowl games for that, and while bowl games have kind of been ruined with all of the opt-outs, that is what those are there for. People are willing to dilute the very thing that makes college football so great, which is the regular season, just to see more fun postseason matchups, and I simply can't agree with that. College football is the only sport where every single regular season game matters, and that is because of how exclusive its postseason is. And that is what makes the sport so great and so unique. It's unlike any other sport in America. And I simply don't see how expanding the playoff to see a fun game between a 12 seed and a 16 seed is worth diluting that regular season and taking away from it. That isn't the point of the sport, in my opinion. And in order to get to it, you have to fundamentally change the regular season and change the sport, which is, like I said, the basis of college football. Then there's the argument that the current format is bad because it leads to SEC teams dominating, and this could not be any further from the truth. Anyone who thinks that expansion will lead to less SEC dominance doesn't understand college football. They don't. Because anything with expansion, any sort of expansion, 6 teams, 8 teams, 12 teams, 16 teams, you're going to have more SEC dominance. The only way to limit SEC dominance is to create a more exclusive playoff, such as like the BCS, where we had one SEC on SEC team game in 16 years, whereas in the playoff that's been going for 8, we've had 2 already in the national championship. I mean, short of a rule capping the number of teams from one conference, which A, the SEC would never and should never agree to, and B, this also directly flies in the face of the entire idea of crowning the true best team at the end of the season, all expansion is going to do is cause more SEC dominance. If the playoff were to go to 12, there's a very real shot you get 4 SEC teams in, at least 3 almost every season, if not every season. It completely negates the already mitigated importance of a conference championship weekend for the good conferences, particularly the SEC, where if you look at like Georgia and Alabama, they have literally no reason to play each other at this point because they're both guaranteed playoff spots. At least this past season, if Bama lost the SEC title, they don't make the playoff, right? For Georgia, they could lose and still get in, and they did, and they still won the national championship. But with 12 to 16, I mean, why even play the game? Because if Georgia's 1 and Bama's 2 or 1 and 4 or 3 and 5, there's no point to play the game at that point. It completely takes away all of the impact and importance of the conference championship other than to say, well, we're the conference champions. But then if you lose in the playoff, who cares? Nobody cares at that point. So there's no point to do that. You're completely ruining championship weekend. And then you see teams like Texas A&M and Ole Miss who are consistently, well, Texas A&M and then Ole Miss from this past season, they're in the 5 to 10 range. They get to sit at home on championship weekend. Doesn't matter to them. They're going to make the playoff no matter what, even though they lost 2 games in the regular season. When Florida is right, and then a lot of times they're sitting on the outside looking in. Kentucky frequently has been right around there, and that's in a down SEC East. I mean, you have teams in all over the SEC West, 4-5 deep. LSU's down when they're good. That could all just be hanging out in that range, and they're going to make the playoff, or at least 3 to 4 of them will, and you're going to see more and more SEC dominance, okay? If you want to limit that, you need to make a more exclusive playoff, not expand one. If Georgia were to lose to Auburn and Kentucky in the regular season, it's not going to matter, because they're still going to make the top 12 as a 10-2 SEC team, and so who cares at that point? And they would be deserving because they would still be one of the 12 to 16 best teams in the country, but you're just going to get more SEC teams. So if that is the reason you think we should expand, you're wrong. That's not going to do what you think it's going to do. I get wanting to see the little guy get a shot more often than they currently do, but are we seriously willing to uproot the entire foundation of the sport just to see more Cincinnatis in the playoff when they likely don't even have a real shot in the first place? I know I'm not willing to do that. Which brings me to my next argument, and that is the crowd that says that expansion is going to fix the talent gap. Simply put, no, it won't, at least not to the extent that you would imagine it would. Let's just look back at other things that we've added to college football to fix the talent gap and see how those have panned out. Have any of them worked? No, they haven't, and that's because the sport is inherently unfair at every level in college football. It's not like the NFL where you have a salary cap, every team's an NFL team, you have mostly the same resources. You have a very similar, if not the same talent pool to pull from. That's not the reality. In the NFL, if you win the Super Bowl, you get the last pick, right? In college football, if you win the national championship, you're probably bringing in a top 5 class. It doesn't, the rich get richer here. It doesn't work that way. And so, expansion doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see more talent go to smaller schools. Look at NIL. Everybody said NIL was going to fix things for the talent gap. It hasn't, and it won't, because the bigger teams have more NIL money and more connections for recruits to land more money. Look at Texas A&M, for example. The transfer portal was supposed to do the same thing. It helps big schools more than small schools. Just look at Alabama. 2 of their best players from last year's team were transfers, namely Jamison Williams, the other being Henry To'oTo'o. Jamison Williams goes to Alabama and is arguably the best receiver in college football. That's not fixing the talent gap at all. I mean, I don't know. I don't understand why people think this is going to be any different than that. You could argue that it gives smaller teams a more legitimate shot at the title, and therefore more players want to go there. But it's not entirely true, because those players know that the big schools are still going to have every advantage in the world over them. They're going to have more funding, they have more NIL opportunities, they have better facilities, they have oftentimes better coaching, they have much more name recognition if you want to build yourself an off-the-field brand. They have a much better shot at getting you into the NFL, at least early rounds of the NFL. They have way better talent as a whole that not only makes their team better and therefore more likely to win in the playoff, but it makes practices better for these players because then they get to compete against the best of the best every day, make themselves even better, and that's what these top-end players want. They're highly competitive, and they know and have seen that practicing against the best of the best prepares you for the next level, and you constantly get to improve. Why? That's not going to change by doing this. I mean, I will grant it might have some impact, particularly in the transfer portal, to cause more middling level teams to pick up some bigger names, but we're already seeing that in a lot of ways with guys like Spencer Rattler going to South Carolina, and it hasn't done anything to make the game much more competitive at the top levels of the sport, and it's not going to. A handful of players deciding to go to Pitt instead of Clemson or Alabama isn't going to change the entire balance of power in the sport. Now, will it help teams like a Michigan State or a South Carolina or things like that? Yes, it will, but it's not going to take teams in, the Cincinnati level of the sport or in the Pac-12, the middle teams there. They're not all of a sudden going to be able to land top 10 recruiting classes and build extreme roster talent through that. It's not going to happen. Will it help some? Maybe. Will it help enough to make the 16 seed a fair shot against the 1 seed or the 5 seed? No, it's not going to do that. Then you have the other issue of the sport still has to work on a school calendar. Players still have to take classes, register for semesters, etc., and expanding complicates this to some extent because then the playoff games are an entirely new semester when a lot of players who are going to the NFL are likely done with school, so that creates weird scheduling conflicts for them versus the players who are still in school, versus then are you still NCAA eligible if you're not registered for school there because you don't want to pay for another semester if you're just going to go pro. Lots of weird things there, not to mention the actual impact on the players who now have to continue playing during another semester when a lot of times they load their more difficult courses there because they know they're not playing football. So there's those complications there, and that doesn't even mention the early enrollee situation for the new players coming in for the next year's team. The common solution to all of this stuff seems to be either cut rest time that players get around finals week in December and around Christmas, which is bad for the players because A, they need the rest time, B, they need to study for finals week, and C, they deserve time at home with their family. These aren't professionals. They are still students and young adults. They're not in the NFL. This isn't a job for them in a lot of ways. And then the other alternative that I've seen for fixing this is to cut the regular season games, go from 12 to 10 or 8, which, again, to me, completely changes the sport and not for the better because the regular season is what the sport is all about. That is what makes college football college football. Cutting that is not going to make the sport any better. Which brings me to my final point, which is why are we so desperate for expansion? Is it because the same teams keep winning it? Because that's what I see a lot. And if that's the reason that people want to expand, I just have to disagree. Georgia won the national championship this year for the first time in over 40 years. Ohio State won the first playoff championship in 2015. They haven't won since then. LSU won it in 2019. Hasn't been in the playoffs since. Clemson won twice, and this year didn't even win their own conference. This year's playoff field, for example, had 2 brand new teams that have never even been to the playoff before in it, and Georgia, who had only been once before. The only team that keeps on winning it is Bama. Literally just remove Nick Saban from this equation, and a large portion of what people are complaining about is fixed. Now, do we really want to completely remake the sport because we can't consistently beat one guy who's probably retiring within the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, is that really what's best for college football? This sport is completely unique in the fact that, like I said, unlike the NFL, it's not a level playing field. Teams have drastically different talent levels and funding and resources, etc., across the country. The 32nd best team in college football is light years worse than the 5th best team, far more so than in the NFL, where everybody is NFL talented. You have obviously a hierarchy to players. There are better players and worse players, but that gap is not even remotely the same as it is in college. The chances of a Cinderella run are so minuscule in this sport because of that, the massive talent disparity and the very nature of football. March Madness works because there are only a handful of players on each team, so there's A, more talent to go around, and B, it allows for, one or two individual players to completely dominate and change the game. They can completely change the world for a program. You get to see a guy like Ja Morant go to a tiny school, and then when he makes the March Madness, he can completely control the game by himself because of how basketball is formatted. That's not how football works. And this, just basketball itself leads to teams going on hot runs that are just kind of out of nowhere. All of a sudden, somebody catches fire from three, and the team can make a run. You don't have that in football, not nearly to the same extent at least. And even still, if you look at the regular season in college basketball, nobody cares about it or watches it. And if you don't believe me, look at the numbers. Nobody watches regular season college basketball. And I don't want that for college football. I don't want college football to become the sport that everybody ignores for the entire regular season and then tunes in for the playoff. No, that's not what college football is. It's not what it should be. I don't think that that's the best thing for the sport, and especially to do all that to it just so we get to see a fun, 12 versus 16 seed matchup in the playoff. To me, completely not worth it. I don't think expansion is the good thing that everybody says it is. Anyway, those are just my opinions on it. Let me know below what you guys think about it. Think about this news, think about the playoff format in general, and if you disagree with me, let me know why you disagree with me, and we can discuss it down there in the comment section. Also, if you made it this far into the video, please go ahead and leave a like because it helps out the channel tremendously. And also subscribe for more college football content in the future as I will continue to upload very regularly going forward. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.